There is nothing like a good story of founding fathers working hard towards building something that they believed in. That exact thing happened in the origins of the amateur radio hobby. Welcome to this first episode of Ham Radio History. This is a new series that I plan to do on this channel where I research a historical topic in amateur radio and then I talk about it. Now this video is going to be pretty long because there's a lot to cover and I'm going to be doing my best to cover as many of the different changes that have happened throughout the history of the amateur radio hobby throughout the years. And when the hobby of amateur radio began, it looked way different than it does today. And if there is one thing that I've taken away from all the research that I've done leading up to this video, it is that the amateur radio hobby ultimately led to the discovery of the electromagnetic spectrum. It also led to the discovery and invention of the spark gap transmitter, several different events over the years that have helped shape the world as we know it today. And then we also ended up with the modern day radio equipment and radio regulations that we have today. And all of it is due to a lot of the people that I'm going to be mentioning today throughout the history of this hobby. But let's start off with how we ended up with the name ham radio, because the name ham radio actually predates the hobby itself. In the 19th century, the term ham was actually a term used in the professional wired telegraphy industry, used to mock telegraph operators with poor Morse code sending skills. And the term ham was actually being used when they were referring to these telegraph operators as being ham-fisted, which meant they were amateurish or unskilled. But it wasn't until around the mid-20th century or so that the amateur radio community started to use this term with a label of pride, which was after the start of the hobby. But the actual history of the amateur radio hobby starts back in the year 1873. And this was when Scotsman James Clerk Maxwell presented his theory of the electromagnetic field. His work was heavily influenced by others before him, such as English scientist Michael Faraday. However, even after Maxwell's experiments and research effort, many were not convinced that Maxwell's findings were true. And since many did not believe that Maxwell's findings were true, this pretty much halted any further developments for nearly 10 years. Until German physicist Heinrich Rudolf Hertz proved Maxwell's findings to be true in the year 1888, after performing a series of experiments in which he studied the properties of electromagnetic waves that were predicted by Maxwell's equations. But none of this mattered to Hertz at all, because he was actually just more interested in the intellectual challenges from his experiments and studies. So future developments in radio technologies came to a screeching halt once again and was left up to others. And one of those others was Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi. Marconi had a huge interest in electrical science and physics since he was a young boy. He studied electrical science and physics in school and believed that there was a possibility of using electromagnetic waves to communicate. Fast forward to the year 1894, when Marconi adapted the theory of the existence of radio waves that James Clerk Maxwell had already proved existed back in the year 1888, and nobody believed. And Marconi took that theory of radio waves that he also believed to be true, and while he was in England with what he believed at the time to be a useful radio, he was able to communicate over a distance of 2 miles without wires during a demonstration with British officials. And I'm sure those guys were pretty surprised at the fact that an inventor that pretty much nobody had heard of at the time had just proved the world to be completely wrong 21 years after Maxwell's discovery of radio waves, and then everybody just blew it off and said they don't exist. Marconi eventually used his findings to develop a practical communication system based on the Hertzian waves, known as wireless telegraphy, in 1897. And wireless telegraphy over the airwaves was a relatively new concept at this time, because before that, the telegraph systems that already existed instead used systems of interconnected transmission lines, not electromagnetic waves. Also in the year 1897, French physicist Edward Branly first coined the term radio based on the verb to radiate. All of this experimenting also possibly meant that Marconi was the first amateur radio operator in history, and this also marked the start of Marconi's professional career. But there is also a second contender for the first possible amateur radio operator and Elmer, known as Englishman Leslie Miller. This is because Leslie Miller was the first person to publish instructions for how to construct a simple-to-build transmitter and receiver for an amateur audience. The instructions were published in an article in the January 1898 issue of the Model Engineer and Amateur Electrician, and this also might mean that Leslie Miller was the first ham radio content creator because he was the first to post how-tos and stuff. Anyways, back to the video. An explosion of interest in amateur radio and in building radios would occur following this, and as the 1800s drew to a close, the hobby of amateur radio was on its way. As the 1900s began, development for commercial uses of radio also started to gain speed. And by the year 1901, Marconi was back at it again, and this time he was on a mission. He sent a wireless signal across the Atlantic Ocean using high power and giant antennas. These early transmitters all generated RF and created an oscillatory spark and were called spark gap transmitters. These early spark gap transmitters were also broadband by their own nature, making it difficult and often impossible for two neighboring stations to be on the air at the same time. From about 1900 to 1908, thousands of Americans began to experiment with radio, though few of them were interested in experimenting with radios as a hobby. And just like the good old days of pretty much everything that man has invented, there were absolutely no regulations on operations of radio at this time. Kind of like cars without seatbelts, first airplanes, among others. Amateur call letters were also self-assigned and often consisted only of the operator's initials during this time. Fast forward to 1904 when Englishman J.A. Fleming created the first vacuum tube dial called the Fleming valve. And then in 1906, Lee DeForest added a grid to a Fleming valve and developed the first triode, naming it the Audion. And not to skip too far ahead, but in 1907, DeForest also used the word radio for what is believed to be the first time in an article. By this time, this was pretty unheard of. Both Fleming and DeForest's inventions would prove to be huge for the future of the development of radios and the amateur radio hobby. But there was also one more big development for the future of radio in 1906, and this was audio transmission. In 1906, R.A. Fessenden used the Alexanderson alternator to make the first voice and music transmissions. By the year 1908, the beginnings of the hobby of amateur radio really began to come to light. Prior to 1908, interest in radios was primarily either as an experimenter or as an entrepreneur, not really as an amateur. But by 1908, definite hobby interests were really starting to be seen, and I'm sure this was especially seen by these first amateur radio operator spouses walking in the ham shack, seeing new gear and saying, well, how much did this cost? In 1909, the first radio club started to be formed, and the spark and long wave bands, aka the 300 to 6,000 meter bands, were on fire. By the year 1910, there were many instances of harmful interference by unlicensed experimenters interfering with government and commercial radio operations being reported, and the time to do something about it was not yet. But in the year 1910, Congress did pass the Wireless Ship Act, which required many ships to carry radio equipment and operators to operate the radios on board their ships. The year 1912 was a year of big changes for the world of radio. The Titanic disaster occurred on April 14th of 1912, and by August 13th of 1912, the Radio Act of 1912 was signed by President William Howard Taft and went into effect on December 12th of 1912. This act restricted experimentation on the medium and long wave bands and regulated experiments to the shortwave bands, aka the 1 to 10 meter bands. This act also established new licensing procedures for all users of radio. And for the first time, amateurs were required to be licensed and were required to have a knowledge of at least 5 words per minute of Morse code. Licenses were initially controlled by the Department of Navy, but that responsibility was later transferred to the Department of Commerce and Labor. 2 license classes of amateur radio licenses were issued at this time, first grade and second grade licenses. And a limited endorsement was also later available to first grade licensed operators. A key part of this legislation was the restriction of most amateur stations to only wavelengths below 200 meters or frequencies above 1500 kilohertz, which greatly limited the amateur radio operator's transmitting range until the discovery nearly a decade later of the distances that were actually achievable through shortwave transmissions. In fact, many actually thought that this legislation would ultimately cause the death of the amateur radio hobby, but that did not happen. Also in the year 1912, the Navy officially adopted the term radio, and this was unheard of at the time because the word was still relatively new to most people. In 1913, Edwin Armstrong developed the regenerative receiver and also discovered that the triode can oscillate. And not to jump too far ahead again, but it wasn't until 1915 that this actually became public knowledge. And this would eventually become an absolute game changer in receiving technology, as this new receiver had greater sensitivity than the crystal detectors that were in use at the time. And although vacuum tubes were expensive expensive at the time, some hams started experimenting with Armstrong's design. Also, the year 1913 was the year that CW was born. The year 1914 brought with it the start of World War I. By 1914, some hams extended their range by relaying messages through other hams, but Connecticut ham Hiram Percy Maxim, call sign at the time 1 Whiskey Hotel, later 1 Alpha Whiskey, realized that messages could be sent more reliably over long distances if relay stations were organized. So he established the ARRL to further the interest of amateur radio operators and become the first president of the ARRL, and then also began publishing QST magazine shortly thereafter. The ARRL remains the largest advocacy organization for amateurs in the United States today. By the year 1917, the United States was fully invested in World War I, and all amateur radio operators were ordered to dismantle their transmitters and receivers. With over 4,000 hams now serving the United States in uniform and no ham radio operators left on the air, QST magazine also temporarily ceased its publication. In 1918, while Edwin Armstrong was serving as a major in the U.S. Army Signal Corps in France, he developed the super heterodyne receiver. Also, CW was used by the United States military forces for the first time during World War I, and World War I finally came to a close on November 11th of 1918. During the war, the Navy was placed in control of all U.S. radio, and as hams began returning home from serving in World War I, they expected that the Navy would rescind the order that shut down amateur radio, but that did not happen. Instead, Secretary of the Navy Joseph Daniels tried to get the Navy a total monopoly on all wireless communications. The ARRL and others appealed this prohibition on amateur radio in order to protect the concept of amateur radio operations, and amateurs were finally able to get back on the air in November 1919 after a House resolution was passed, ultimately ending the prohibition. And as the United States entered the 1920s, hams were back on the air once again. The ARRL relay network was also back up and running again, with records regularly being broken. By the beginning of the 1920s, the prices of vacuum tubes had started to fall and caused a rise in the popularity of Edwin Armstrong's sensitive regenerative receiver. This also led to an increased range for spark stations because these new receivers could hear weak signals that previously hadn't been detectable. Some more advanced hams were also beginning to experiment with the super heterodyne receiver, which was invented by Armstrong as well as Frenchman Lucien Levy during World War I. And more amateurs were also starting to use vacuum tubes in their own transmitters, generating continuous wave signals. These CW signals were much narrower and were actually only about 1% of the width of a spark signal. And this also helped to reduce RF interference and allowed an increase in the number of stations that could be on the air at the same time. This innovation also eventually led to a decrease in the number of spark transmitters that were on the air. Also around this time, as the distance of amateur radio stations began to increase, so did the popularity of the concept of DX communication. Transatlantic transmitting and receiving tests began occurring around the year 1921 to see if low-power amateur signals could cross the Atlantic Ocean or not. And they also showed that CW signals were far superior to spark signals. By 1922, amateur radio call signs were now being assigned by the government. Previously, call signs were made up of the operator's own initials. By 1923, two-way communications between North America and Europe looked to be only a matter of time. And all of this experimentation with transatlantic two-way contacts finally paid off on November 27th of 1923, when French station 8 Alpha Bravo contacted Connecticut hams Fred Schnell, 1 Mike Oscar, and John Reinhardt's 1 X-ray Alpha Lima using CW on a wavelength of 110 meters. These experiments continued on, and by late 1924, a CW contact was made between a station in England and a station in New Zealand, which are almost halfway around the world from each other. In 1925, the International Amateur Radio Union, aka the IARU, was formed following an informal meeting in 1924 of representatives from France, Great Britain, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, Spain, Luxembourg, Canada, and the United States. Plans were then made to hold an International Amateur Congress in Paris, France in April of 1925. This Congress was held with the purpose of founding an international amateur radio organization. This Congress ended up being attended by representatives from 23 different countries in Europe, the Americas, and Asia. A constitution for the IARU was adopted on April 17th of 1925, and the formation of the International Amateur Radio Union was ratified on April 18th of 1925, which is the day now known as World Amateur Radio Day. In 1926, Brandon Wentworth, 6 Oscar India, worked and confirmed all continents from a station that he had set up in a pasture on the Stanford University campus in Stanford, California. This was huge for this time and had likely not been done before. Also, by the end of 1926, spark gap transmitters were now outlawed on all the amateur radio bands. In 1927, the ARRL International Relay Party, the predecessor of the ARRL International DX contest, was hosted for the first time. And also by this time, many government and commercial entities were beginning to see the value of shortwave radio communications due to the work of amateur radio operators. And by the end of the 1920s, wide open radio bands were pretty much gone. But hams now had harmonically related bands on 160 meters through 5 meters, as well as a narrow band to use in the 70 centimeter band. In 1927, the United States Congress passed the Radio Act of 1927, which created the Federal Radio Commission under the Department of Commerce, and then licensing responsibilities were then transferred to the FRC. The 1930s was a new era for radio. Spark radios were now a thing of the past and were banned, and all amateurs were now using vacuum tube transmitters and receivers on the air. By this time, phone operations over radio still wasn't as common as CW, but was really starting to gain in popularity. And while working at Tohoku Imperial University, Japanese professor and electrical engineer Hidetsugu Yagi began to study an array of dipole antennas that formed a directional beam for communication over the electromagnetic waves a few years earlier. Yagi's design was eventually patented as the Yagi-Uda antenna in 1926. And by the 1930s, the design of the Yagi-Uda antenna was adopted for amateur radio, and several hams had now begun experimenting with these new Yagi antennas on the HF and other amateur radio bands. The Radio Act of 1927 lasted only 7 years until 1934 Congress passed the Communications Act of 1934, pulling the plug on the FRC and establishing a new agency called the Federal Communications Commission, aka the FCC. This had no immediate effect on hams other than that their affairs were now going to be handled by the FCC, which is still the same FCC that exists today. But a little later, under the FCC, amateur licensing was also reorganized into 3 classes of licenses, Class A, B, and C. This legislation change also now required the use of accurate logging of contacts. And by 1937, interest in DX was still on the rise. After discussions of what should classify a country, the ARRL announced the creation of the DXCC program. And the debate over what classifies an entity to be classified as its own DXCC still remains debated to this day. By September 1939, war was breaking out across Europe once again. The amateur radio hobby pretty much immediately halted again across most of the European countries and most of the British Commonwealth nations, including Canada. Hams continued to operate in the United States, but DX was now hard to come by since most of the rest of the world was already at war. And then once the 1940s arrived, the rest of the world was still at war. On June 5th of 1940, the FCC issued an order banning hams from contacting any foreign stations. Portable and mobile operations on frequencies below 56 MHz were also banned, although the FCC made a specific exception for Field Day and later for the Amateur Emergency Corps. Then on December 7th of 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor happened and the United States was now at war. And amateur radio activity in the United States was now screeched to a halt once again. Many on the home front kept their radio skills honed in on 112 MHz as members of the War Emergency Radio Service. This service was important and was taken very seriously by the participants of it, but lacked the pleasures of normal amateur radio operations solely as a hobby. At the start of World War II, some 60,000 Americans were licensed as amateur radio operators, and it was estimated that approximately 25,000 of those licensed hams served in the armed forces during World War II. By the year 1945, it was clear that it was only a matter of time until World War II would be coming to an end. And World War II finally ended on August 17th of 1945. And only 4 days later, hams were back at home and back on the air once again. By the summer of 1946, nearly all the amateur radio bands were restored to normal from 3.5 MHz to 30 MHz. The old bands at 5 meters and 2.5 meters were eventually replaced by new bands at 6 and 2 meters. And DXing on the HF bands was also back. US amateurs were allowed to contact foreign stations again, the DXCC program was restored, and interest in operating VHF-UHF started to take a jump forward as surplus military gear became widely available at prices that were near giveaways after the war ended. HF operators were also in luck, as surplus transmitters, receivers, components, and just about anything you could possibly need was now available from military surplus stores. This surplus also gave a huge boost to a new mode, at least new to hams, RTTY. The introduction of RTTY was huge for amateur radio, and this was truly the first digital mode. Many hams worked with RTTY while serving in the military during World War II, and when the equipment needed to communicate using RTTY appeared as surplus equipment, it quickly disappeared from the shelves of surplus stores and now into ham shacks throughout the United States. And as hams were finally getting back on the air once again, the public was just as happily buying newly introduced TV sets. But one of the greatest threats to amateur radio quickly became television interference. The TVI issue has decreased significantly over time, although it still has never been completely solved. Interference to and from TVs and other home entertainment systems continues to plague the hobby still to this day. By September 1947, Mike Villard, Whiskey 6 Quebec Yankee Tango, and a couple of student hams at Stanford University started experimenting with single sideband on the amateur radio bands. Although this experimenting started in 1947, it still took nearly a decade before single sideband was a common sound on the amateur radio bands.